Acts 23 is where we are tonight, everybody. As always, I'm going to give us the quick kind of 1 minute reminder of where we just came from. It's good to have a few of you back who have been out for various health reasons. We're so glad to have you join us tonight and be part of the conversation and the crowd. So, if you remember, Paul was excited to go to Jerusalem, even though the prophets told him what would happen. Persecution, he'd get beat up, it would be an ugly situation, but he was still excited to share with his people the gospel. And so that's what he did. And then all of a sudden, if you remember, they dragged Paul, a huge mob surrounded Paul, and the Roman legions, along with their commander, dragged Paul up the steps to the courthouse, and he gave a bit of a speech that got somewhat interrupted because they weren't too pleased with what he was saying. And they drug him in and they took him back. And so that's where, and he told them that he was what? Roman citizen, which we remember from last week means he had all kinds of tremendous rights and privileges that other people did not have. They could not beat him or flog him without him properly being gone through the courts and those kind of things. They couldn't do things of abuse, so to speak, to him that they would do just a normal person who they arrested. And so the commander is still trying to figure out who Paul is. And so here we are. We got into chapter 23 a tiny bit, but I'd like to kind of just start from there. Go ahead, brother.
Was Paul arrested when he was sent to Rome? How many was under guard?
We'll get there by the end of the chapter, and your question will be answered. Because this is before he's about to be sent to Rome. So that's how our chapter will end then. And so it's a good question, but we're just not quite there yet. Yeah, a lot of people like to just jump to knowing he was sent to Rome because the last, 5 chapters is all about that. But first we focus on what happened here. So what they did was the Roman leaders and authorities, they brought in the Sanhedrin. Now, does anybody remember who the Sanhedrin is? The Sadducees and the Pharisees. There were 3 major groups of religious leaders. There was the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. John the Baptist, we believe, was an Essene. The Essene was just this simple, quiet group that lived off in the caves and in the mountains, and we would kind of call them holy monks in a sense. That's not a perfect explanation, but they were teachers, scribes, and monks. And so they didn't get embroiled in all of this stuff that was going on in town. They more did their thing out in the wilderness. People would go to them. If you remember with John the Baptist, people went out to John the Baptist to hear him preach, and then they were baptized. It was kind of that concept with the Essenes. And so we're going to look, first of all, just a reminder about the Sanhedrin, so we're all on the same page. There was the Great Sanhedrin and the Lesser Sanhedrin. In smaller areas, it was a group of 23 men mixing the Sadducees and Pharisees, which we'll talk about in a minute, the difference. But then the Great Sanhedrin, which many actually believe this might have been, was a collection of all of them from the different areas that had 71 leaders. So we don't know for sure it was the greater one, but obviously this was in Jerusalem, and if there was ever a place for them all to be gathered, it would be in Jerusalem, right? So it seems logical that in that Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin was broken up by the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, this is interesting because almost like any other group, you had your liberal side and your conservative side. Let me break down real quickly for you a slight difference between the two. Okay. The Sadducees were sad, you see. Oh, that's terrible. That's terrible. All right, just making sure you're with me. All right. And 3 people walked out. Just kidding, those of you watching online. They give me more slack. All right. So the Sadducees, a few things we can learn about them. And let me get to my right page here. Okay. The Sadducees, they were what we would consider religious liberals. And I want to be careful using that term because in our time it's slightly different than that time, but not that different actually. They were people who did not believe in the whole Old Testament. They only believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. They believed the prophets were pretty much worthless. The historic writings were worthless. The history was worthless. They only followed Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So when the Pharisees would quote from other books, did they put any validity in them? No. So you can already see that this is a huge break, right? Just like today, we have people who say we have the Holy Scriptures, and I believe it's the Word of God. And other people will say, well, there's a bunch of good ideas in there, but I don't think we have to really believe it's literally the Word of God. It's the separation idea, and that's what we have going on here. The Sanhedrin had a larger majority of the Sadducees than the Pharisees. Now, the Sadducees did not believe that there was any resurrection. In a way, they were agnostic. They believed that when you die, you die. And that's the end of it. Whereas the Pharisees believed strongly in an afterlife. The Sadducees also did not believe that there were angels or demons or spiritual beings. I mean, after all, if they believed when you died, you just didn't exist, why would there be a need for angels and demons and such, right? But now what's that? But like today, they can explain all that away. They can say that wasn't really an angel. That was just a self-induced vision of what they thought was happening. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, you can explain away anything pretty much if you try hard enough and don't want to believe it. Because it's a great point, but that's their theology. Now, the Pharisees were on the exact opposite side. They believed in angels, they believed in demons, they believed in visions, they believed in dreams, they believed in the fulfillment of Joel, that your young man will see vision, your old man will dream dreams. They believed in all of that. And so you can see how when these two groups got together, there was not just animosity, but there was true hatred in a lot of times. I mean, if any of you have been on any kind of social media and seen Christians interact of different persuasions, you know it does not take long till the gentle dialogue turns into ungodly hatred for one another. I like to sit in the middle and point out both problems on each side, but that's just my thing. And so, I just like to, yeah. Who what? It would be a mix of the two. But that being said, actually what I read is the Sadducees ran kind of the upper political side of the temple because they considered themselves the rich aristocrats, where the Pharisees considered themselves more the among the people, do the daily sacrifices and all of those types of things. So you kind of have the Sadducees from their perspective, and those other Pharisees that are dealing with the people. The Sadducees believed they were above being around the people too much. So, yeah.
You said that they believed in resurrection, the Pharisees. Clearly, not the same kind of resurrection that Christians believe.
That's where it'll get tricky. Because right here, we're going to get there in a moment, Jim, where, if you remember, Nicodemus was a Pharisee. And he seemed to have come to have relationship with Christ. He seemed to come to that point in John 3 through that interaction, right? So many of the Pharisees you'll find were listening and even converted, where very rarely, in fact, I'm not saying it's not there, but off the top of my head, I can't think of an instance where someone of the Sadducees was converted. Because they couldn't get past there is no resurrection. And if the first primary part of your teaching is Christ died and rose again, and you don't believe in that, you're not even going to engage in that. It's kind of someone coming up to me and saying, well, if you die, you'll be reincarnated. Now, that doesn't mean I can't be friends with that person, but theologically, I know that we are already far as east is from the west in our perspectives. And so that's how they would view. Does that answer your question? And so the Pharisees believed in resurrection, which is what Paul's going to play to his advantage in a few verses down as we get down into the chapter. Well, I wasn't there, and so I can't tell you for sure. All I would guess is, just knowing modern secularism within religious circles, is that when he would try to explain it away, well, I don't know what word they would have used, but he was in a coma. They thought he was dead, but he wasn't dead. Or it was some kind of trick, or something like you. Like I said, you can explain away anything. I mean, people say Jesus didn't raise from the dead. I'm sure the apostles came and rolled away the stone and took Jesus out. And the idea that the apostles or fooled 16 Roman soldiers who would die if the body was taken, roll the stone up the hill without the Romans noticing, is almost as far-fetched as believing in a resurrection. So, but you see what I mean? You can explain away anything if you really don't want to believe it. Just that's the way it is. So, all right. So that just gives you an idea. I want to take that time because this whole next section is going to deal with this group of people, and it will be fascinating the way Paul uses his huge brain to make these people interact. So, in ending verse chapter 22, the next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly what Paul was being accused of. Remember, the commander was neutral, right? He just didn't want a riot because a riot could cost him his life. So he didn't really care if Paul was guilty or innocent. He just didn't want a riot. So he wanted to get to the end of this. So he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Can you just picture this moment? I mean, this is like somebody saying, Matt, we want you to come speak at the National Atheist Convention, and they're going to listen to you. I'd be like, oh, I'll be ready. Yeah, you prep, you're ready. Paul has been prepped for this moment. And remember, he's not trying to just win an argument. He's trying to win people from death to life. He's trying to bring his people to the knowledge of Jesus Christ. So this isn't just about winning a debate. This is about seeing lives transformed for Paul. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, my brothers. Why did he call them my brothers? Jewish, but also to be polite and what? Well, he wasn't talking to the Romans per se right now. He was talking to the Sanhedrin. Exactly. There is a very good chance. Obviously, we can't prove, but there's a highly educated guess that Paul knew a bunch of these guys. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He ministered in this area. He persecuted Christians in this area. He was respected and well thought of in this area. He went to school at the highest school with Gamaliel with some of these men. So some of these men probably knew him from way back in their school days, the high school and college days. And so as he's talking to them, this isn't some foreign group. These are people he most likely knows a lot about. He says, I fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. Now, real quick, do you remember what he's referring to here? What was that? That he went where God told him to do and did what God told him to do and preached what God told him to do, right? So in other words, he's saying, my hands are clean. In love, I have given you the gospel. I have come and risked my life for you. So he's starting out from that perspective. At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Now that's not a good moment, is it? I wouldn't appreciate it if when I'm preaching some Sunday, David Burns walks across the stage and says, whack, right across the mouth. I wouldn't appreciate that at all. I know you'd all run to my defense and everything like that. We'd all sit shocked, wouldn't we? You'd think it was some kind of skit or something going on, right? And so, yes, and he should have. At that moment, according to Roman law, that person who struck him should have been arrested, at least arrested, if not executed. But this fella is caught in a really difficult place. Because if he does that, what's going to happen? Riot. And so he's sitting here, and we're going to see later on in the letter he writes to Felix, which is kind of the next step up of governor. We're going to see that he pretty much says, you take this. I don't want anything to do with this whatsoever. And so he manipulates the facts and everything. So right now, I truly believe of all the people, he is probably most scared. We know Paul's not scared. And we have to assume the Sanhedrin's not scared because they feel like they're in control. But this guy knows that he could be in a lot of trouble really quick. So you're 100% right, but I think real life factored into it at the same time. All right. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. And we talked last week about who else called somebody a whitewashed tomb in the Bible. Jesus called who it? Pharisees. Yes, he called the Pharisees. Now, there may have been some Sadducees mixed in, but normally they mention the Pharisees. Because again, the Sadducees tended to focus on higher level stuff, political stuff, whereas the Sadducees were in the daily life of Jesus and everyone else. Okay. He says, you sit there and judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. That's what you were saying. Broke the law. Those who were standing near Paul said, you dare insult the high priest? Paul replied, brothers, I didn't realize he was the high priest, for it is written, do not speak evil against your rulers. So, now there are 3 different ways to interpret this situation, and you are welcome to choose the one you like. One, he could have been using sarcasm. He could have been saying, well, if you're the high priest, you sure as heck ain't acting like it. And I don't recognize you as high priest at all. Number 2, he didn't know. This was kind of a secret meeting. They probably were not decked out in all of their vestments and everything, and he may not have known. I mean, Paul he was originally from this area, but he hadn't been in this area for decades, right? He may not have known what the high priest looked like. And so it's possible he didn't even know it was the high priest. And he said, oh, you're right, I didn't know. Number 3 is there's a lot of evidence. I shouldn't say a lot. There's some evidence throughout the New Testament, in Paul's writings, that one of the things he was afflicted with through his many beatings was it affected his eyesight. I don't know if you've heard that before. Now, you have to read into it a little bit, but allow me to share with you from Galatians real quick. In Galatians 4, verse 15, Paul writes, what has happened to all your joy? I can testify that if you could have done so, you would have torn out your eye and given it to me. Have I now become an enemy to you? That, in other words, some people believe that his eyesight was so poor that people would have been willing to give them their eyes because they cared about him so much. And then farther on in that same book in Galatians, in chapter 6, verse 11, Paul's very writing says, see what large letters I use as I write to you with my own hand. And some people believe that that's a sign that he took over writing from that point and didn't have Luke write because he was writing in larger script because he couldn't see as well. Now, you don't have to buy into that argument. I don't think either argument is super compelling either way, but there is a tradition in church history that Paul had bad eyesight because of all the beatings and persecution. So either he was using sarcasm, or he didn't really know, or his eye problems caused it so he couldn't see who it was that hit him. So, anybody feel strongly about one of the 3 that they want to defend, or at least say? Yeah, they struck him, and that's when Paul responded. Right. Mm-hmm. So you lean towards one of the first 2. Yeah. Yeah, me too. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And you make a good point that sarcasm was probably a bad word. In a sense, it could have been almost what we call like a word of knowledge or a prophetic utterance, where he was declaring what this man was. Because this high priest was known throughout the Jewish writings of Josephus to be a horribly greedy man, a vicious man, like not a very positive example of the priesthood. He could be bought, he could be manipulated, like he was a really evil leader. There you go. And so, yeah. Yes. I'll just go with your pronunciation. And if I agree with you, we both look smart. And so that, yes, Nebuchadnezzar, good old Nebuchadnezzar. That what? Touch not his anointed. Yes, but without going into too much tangent, that scripture has been radically, in our day, manipulated to say that you should never disagree with a leader. And that, I think we all know that is bunk. Hey, bud. So, hey, bud. So, I would argue, yeah, it's certainly don't gossip, don't slander, or anything like that. So that would be included in it. And so, but that's a little outside where I want to go right now. But yeah, that would. I think that could apply here. Yeah. How much they hated him. They assassinated him. I forget how far later on, but I remember that it happened. Yeah. Yeah, and we're getting close to that now. And so, yeah. Yeah, we're probably about 5-6 years away from. I'm sorry, what was that? Yeah, if you look at verse 2 of 23, it says, "At this the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near to strike him on the mouth." Okay, you're right. It does not say they struck him, and I have given that no thought, so I have no answer to that. That's a good observation. That's actually a good point, because that would answer what Collis said, that he didn't strike him. Interesting. Yeah. Yep. To strike, and that was not unusual. Usually, if the Sanhedrin felt you were a heretic or anything like that, they would all walk up to you, spit on you, and smack you in the face. And so you had to just stand there. A lot of people think that's what happened to Jesus the night before he was crucified. We don't know that for sure, but that they each came up and slapped him across the face, in a sense, saying that. So yeah. So actually, you win that argument, or that discussion. It doesn't say for sure. Well, all right, you're up here now. Go ahead. Oh, okay. I thought I got out of it for the night, man. Yes, Shelly's got something. Or was he talking to the guy saying by commanding it, you're violating the law? By commanding that I be struck. So, well, I think we can agree this is a gray area issue. Thank you very much. All right, 25 minutes in. How we all doing? That was our review. Okay, now we'll see. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. It has, because we feel like we're being drawn into the text. Yeah, and really the Acts is written like that. It just kind of keeps bringing you in farther and farther, especially since these whole last 5-6 chapters will be all about Paul, in the whole situation. So that's good. All right. Cool if I move on, everybody? Move on? All right. Paul replied, we can pass that, 6. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees. At this point, Paul realizes they're not going to listen to him. And so he does uses wonderful rhetoric to change the situation to make it so that instead of him being the problem, they create each other the problem. Now, remember, he knows these people, right? At least he knows the hearts of these people. And so he says, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee." Now you can see all the Pharisees in the crowd going, "Amen, amen." And what are those Sadducees doing? Yes, pretty much. Gnashing teeth at him. Like, we don't like these Pharisees. He said, "I stand on trial because of my hope in what?" And by that statement, the resurrection of the dead, what did he just do? Boom, Sadducees over. Let's get ready to rumble. That's what it is. You got the Sadducees on one side and the Pharisees on the other side. And now, all of a sudden, who are they turning their angst against? Each other. And Paul's just like, They're just hanging out there in the middle, right? Yeah. And I don't know if he fully danced. It doesn't say that in the scripture. So, but when he said this, a dispute broke out among the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees, who say there's no resurrection and that there's neither angels or demons, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So they just summed up for us in one verse what I took 10 minutes to explain to you. That's why the Bible rocks. Okay. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. What were they arguing about? Nothing wrong with him. We find nothing wrong with this man. Why? Because they believe in visions, they believe God talks to people, and they believe in the resurrection of the dead. And that was his whole testimony, right? From all the way back in Acts chapter 9, when he said, Jesus appeared to me. And that was his whole testimony. That's why, what's that great line? The person with a testimony is never at the mercy of someone who disagrees with them, because they can't force you to not believe your own testimony, because it's what God did in your life. And so we move on here. We said, we find nothing wrong with this man. They said, what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? That's a powerful statement, isn't it? Yeah. All of a sudden, their hearts are starting to change a little bit here, saying, okay, this guy might have something. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid for Paul that he'd be torn to pieces by them. He ordered... Tell me this wouldn't make a great movie. I mean, there's a whole book of Acts. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away, being forced to bring him to the barracks. So, the commander, whose only goal was to keep what from happening? A riot. And what was about to happen? So he said, forget all this junk. Get out of here, Paul. And they took him down. Kicked the Sanhedrin out of there and said, if you want to fight, go fight somewhere else. And I'm sure they did have some parking lot discussions after this meeting. Can't we agree? Okay. But notice, just by that moment, that he may have turned the hearts of some of the Pharisees. Because we see them coming in a line. Remember, a lot of them respected Paul earlier, and they didn't respect Christianity. But now here's the man they respect, giving testimony of things they believe could happen. He may have turned some of them at this point. And so God may have just set up this example for that to happen. But now what I really want us to talk about for a moment, that is something personal for each of us, is at this moment, what do you think Paul would be feeling or experiencing inside? Just drug up the steps, brought the Sanhedrin in, this whole situation we just discussed happened. Where's Paul going to be at right now? Because now he's still in chains in Jerusalem. So there's a confidence inside that he honored God with what he did, right? And that's what he said early in 23. Yeah. Yep, that before God, he was innocent of what just happened. That's good. Anyone else? There was a peace. I would argue there may have been a peace, but there was also a piece of him that wasn't at peace. And I think I can prove that in just about 10 seconds, okay? But not that you're wrong, but I think there's a part of it. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right, and that they just ignored it all the way. Now, where was Paul? Oh, go ahead, Jim.
That approach did not, they knew him before he was a Christian.
Right, they knew him as a great, outstanding Jew. Yeah.
So the fact that now he's not the same person,
Right.
would he expect them to just automatically buy what he said?
He probably wouldn't automatically, but like they were saying, you still hope. You know, when you become a Christian, you still hope that people... Right. Right. That was the last they heard of him, was sending him off to Damascus to take out those Christians. Next thing you know, they heard the stories. The one who was persecuting the faith is now preaching it. And so, yep. Yep.
educated men, he flipped it to one sentence.
That's really good that these were highly educated men, and in just well, for us as a verse or two, boom, he just changed the whole circumstances. And so, yeah. When that was happening, you have to think he had a little smirk. I know. Carlos, did you have one last thing before we move on?
He used his parents' training to split the 70
Yeah.
and he got attention off of him so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you notice, it's when he realized that they were not ready to embrace the gospel that he said, okay, well, let's just take care of the situation. Now, remind me, we know Paul wanted to go to Jerusalem, but where was Paul's ultimate goal to end up? And so you have to wonder when we read this next verse, if Paul was concerned with what was going on, that he would never end up in Rome. Because the next thing God does is he sees his servant, his son, his man, who's in this place, maybe feeling a bit challenged by everything that happened and maybe wondering, what's God doing? Has this thrown off God's plan? We've all asked that, right? God, is this still your plan? Have you thrown off your plan here? And Paul may have been wondering that at this point because here, God shows up in a prison cell and he says, the following night, so he had a night to think about this, the Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. Does anybody remember an Old Testament figure who also had to go off on his own and God had to show up and say, be not afraid? Jeremiah? He certainly said something like that to Jeremiah. See, I have too smart of a class. I'm just focused on Joshua's what I was thinking about, but I forgot the class is so smart. You guys all know all this. Because we learned Sunday he did that for Gideon. We learned, I guess it just proves that God cares about us, darn it. The little things. And so if you remember back, just as a quick reminder, when Joshua was asked to take over for Moses, which I think we can all agree is a pretty big ask. Yes? Yep. It was big for me. I felt stepping into Mark Eldridge's shoes. I couldn't imagine God saying, see, Moses, you're next up. That's a good one, God. I'm not so sure about that. And so Joshua, who's not sure, he goes and God speaks to him and says to him, be strong and courageous because you will lead the people into the inheritance I swore to you. And right after that, he says, be strong and courageous. And that same God who spoke to Joshua to take him into the promised land is speaking to Paul as he brings him into Rome. He says, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome. So after this chapter, we're going to see they're sending him off to Rome, and that's where the rest of the book is going to happen. What was so special about Rome? For Paul. Okay. He had a connection with the people there. Anyone else? There was a large Jewish population. Yes. What city in the United States could you mention and everyone goes, oh, I know that one? Washington, D.C. What else? Of course, Jacksonville. That's the home of the Jaguars, baby. Yeah, that's what they'll say. New York was more the direction I was looking in. Maybe even L.A., right? One of those big cities. Rome, if you took all three of those big cities and squished them together, and you could even add Jacksonville, put them all together, Rome was bigger. Rome was the world at that time. I mean, they didn't own everything, but they were seen as the ultimate power in the world at that time. Nobody messed with Rome. I'm sure there was a part of that where he just was like, I've given you the gospel here. It's time for me to move on and get away from all this kind of persecution. That's part of it. I can't hear you, man. He's got a huge audience in Rome, right? It's the mega piece of the world, right? Yeah. It is the Goliath of the New Testament. Just like Babylon was in the Old Testament, the second half of the Old Testament. And so, yeah. That's good. And so I just want to point out one practical principle for all of us, well, two really. One, that when we are struggling, that there is a God who wants to speak courage into us, even in trying circumstances. At that moment, while Paul's sitting in a jail cell for about a day at this point, was there anything that pointed to the fact that he was going to be sent to Rome? End of the road, death. He was going to be stuck here in this place, right? But all of a sudden, God says, no, I'm going to fulfill the calling I put on your life. And I don't know if anyone in here has, it doesn't have to be a place. It can be something he's invited, you think God has asked you to do at some point. It can be anything that is bigger than you've accomplished yet. God is saying, be courageous, because I've not fulfilled my work for you yet, or else I'd have already taken you to be with me. Amen? And so it's a strong word for us. I know just this afternoon as I was praying through this passage, I just felt like the Lord said, so know that I'm still going to have you preach in Scotland, Matt, because that's my Rome. I've always wanted to go and minister in Scotland to those people, my what's it called? Ancestors. That's the word. I was going to say my territory. It's not my, well, I do own 1 foot by 1 foot thanks to my wife. So yeah, but yeah. Hang on, go ahead, Greg. Right. Well, there was the time that he had a vision, and he was told to go to Macedonia for the people, but that's not quite the same thing. But it was the voice of the Lord that spoke to him, but it's not quite the same thing as what you're saying. I'm annoyed at myself because I wrote down all the chapters to answer that question, but I didn't write down all the verses, and I know it'll be too long for me to try to search them out right now. Right. Yeah, there was something very real about that was going on in that prison. You're right, yeah. Now, what's interesting is, did you know who else stayed in this exact same prison? Given that we're studying Acts, and Acts is about two main people, who? Peter and Paul. So if it's not Paul, who's the answer? Wrong. No, it is. Yeah, it's Peter. It's Peter. The answer's Peter. Set you up, knock you down. No. Do you remember when Peter was put in jail and an angel appeared to him and just knocked off those chains, kicked open that door and said, get on out of here? That's the Matt translation of the Bible. But yeah, but do you all remember that? About 2.5, 3 months ago when we studied that in the earlier part of Acts, right? That happened it was in Acts 12, that whole process happened. Notice that for one man of God, Jesus sent an angel to cut him loose and let him go. For another man of God, he left him there. Which means that God has different purposes and plans for all of us, yes? And so it reminds me of that time at the end of the book of John where Jesus is telling Peter about how he's going to give up his life for him, how somebody's going to lead you away bound and he's going to end up being crucified upside down. And Peter, feeling pretty freaked out, looks back at John and goes, what about him? And Jesus' simple answer was what? Let him worry about him. Really, that's what Jesus said. He said, let John worry about John. I'm telling you what's going to happen for you. And so when we read this, understand, I don't know if it was the exact same cell, but the same prison where Peter was cut loose, Paul was not cut loose. And we all, I'm not even going to ask it rhetorically, because we all know it's not because God liked Peter more than Paul, right? Right, yeah. Very, very possible, if they weren't killed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But certainly, because we're only talking about a decade or so, a little more than a decade later. So yeah, it's very possible. Absolutely. I might have got him a little concerned too. A little tighter look. But just above all, we've talked about a lot of things, but realize the biggest thing we learn from this is that when we are in great need, God is still with us. And we trust that he may not show up in person, but that his Spirit is talking to us and he's guiding our steps, even when we cannot see him. Because Paul needed that encouragement right now, and right on, God showed up and encouraged him. All right. So, on to verse 12. The next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. That's pretty serious, don't you think? That's pretty serious. You got to be really ticked off at a guy to be willing for that. Because understand, was Paul, do you think, being led around, after all that happened, is Paul being led around by one guard? No, there's probably a whole legion, perhaps 100 other that they're talking about having to engage with. So these men are not just worried about giving up their food, but a lot of them are probably realizing they're giving up their life because of their hatred of Paul to make this kind of commitment. So, they went to the priests and elders and said, we've taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you, the Sanhedrin, petition the commander to bring him out before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about the case. I mean, that would work, wouldn't it? We just want to know more about it. We are ready to kill him before he gets here. Now, we're going to learn that Paul gets away. So what do you think happened to these 40 guys that made this commitment? Or they're chasing him, right? So let me share with you real quick. This is not something you'll probably want to stick in your mind forever and ever, but at this time, the Jewish people followed something called the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah was a writing down of the oral traditions of the Jewish people. So if we were the Jewish people and we were all the leaders and we had come up with some fantastic proverbs and sayings, these were the type of thing, and they were circulated around verbally. These were the things they pulled together and made into these great writings. And many people created them to be equal with Old Testament scripture. It was called the Mishnah. And one of the things in the Mishnah said, if you make a vow before God, you must fulfill it unless it is no longer possible to do so. So they gave them an out within that vow, that they could make the argument, well, it's no longer possible because he's gone. So it doesn't mean they necessarily backed out on their promise. Well, in a way they did. And it doesn't mean they fulfilled their promise and starved to death. But holding to the Mishnah, they may have then gone forward in that direction. So that's something you never have to understand again, but it made me look smart, so I wanted to share it with you. All right. But when the son of Paul's sister, what? Where did nephew come from? We're 23 chapters in here. Anybody ever hear of a nephew? A sister? Anybody? You think at some point that might have come up, don't you? So out of nowhere, just when Paul, after all of the crazy things he had to go through, needed it, God provided a nephew in the right place at the right time to save Paul. Can we say God is sovereign? That he was 10 steps ahead of everybody else in this situation. Now, some people believe that Paul's nephew may have been following in Paul's footsteps and been studying to become a Pharisee, and that's why he was around when the Sanhedrin was talking about that. We don't know that, but it's certainly plausible to wonder about that, because why else would he have been there? But nonetheless, Paul's sister heard of this plot, and the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, and he went to the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, now, isn't this interesting? How many prisoners do you think got to go order centurions around? Right? Yeah, I think very few. Do you know why the centurion was obligated to listen to Paul and do what he said? Roman citizen. Is that what everybody said? Because he was a Roman citizen. Exactly. That's right. That's right. And so, right. Yeah, that's true. And so that, though the centurion was not forced to do it, really to protect himself, Because if something would have happened and it would have come out that he could have stopped the plot, then he probably at least would have been tortured, if not killed. And I have to think that Paul probably built a pretty good relationship with these guys, don't you think? I mean, we see Paul as a pretty loving guy, unless you're a whitewashed tomb, right? Unless you slap him in the face, then maybe not. But, Paul. So here we go. And Paul calls the centurion and says, take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him. So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, Paul, the prisoner sent me to ask you to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. So now here's God using this simple young man. And just to be real, you think this young man was a bit scared? I mean, he's going before one of the top commanders of the area, the entire region, and he's standing there, this young guy, and he's about to tell him about this plot that's happening. We don't really know, but the fact that he was not a Pharisee yet, if he was studying, would have him in the teenagers to young 20 range, if that part of it is true. And just the way it's described, I would think that's accurate. The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, what is it you want to tell me? He said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him, the plot. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 men are waiting to ambush him. They then took an oath not to eat or drink until they've killed him. They are ready now, waiting for the consent to your request. And it says the commander dismissed the young man and cautioned him to do what? Not telling him. Why do you think he didn't want him to tell anybody? Not only would they change their plan, but you wouldn't find out if it was true or not. Right? When those guys came to him the next day and said, hey, we'd like to talk to him a little more. I think the commander had something to talk to them about, don't you think? And so, but I think both are true. And so here, the biggest part of this section is that we see that God is for Paul, just as he's for us, and he can walk steps ahead, taking care of situations. But do you think Paul had any idea that his nephew in Jerusalem would be used to save him from a plot of people that wanted his death? No. I mean, I'm sure he believed God could work anyway, and God gave him the courage to know that he was going to go to Rome, but I'm sure he didn't say, oh, my nephew's going to come through. No, he had no idea, right? Might have been one of the last people he thought about. To be honest, we don't even know his nephew was a Christian, do we? No, we just know that he was his nephew. He may have been. Hopefully he was, but we don't know. You would think so, just like all pastors' kids are Christians, right? Just something to point out there. But you make a good point. What's amazing? They weren't to blame then, right? Well, sort of, yeah, they weren't to blame. And so, right. And so we see in the next section, then he called two of his centurions and ordered them, get ready to detach a detachment of how many soldiers? 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. That is a big crowd to take care of Paul. Don't you agree? I mean, that's pretty good. Not only is God going to send you to Rome, Paul, let me give you one serious escort on your way there to make sure you get there. And you have to just wonder, Paul's just riding along, this huge, massive army all around him, marching forth. There was no 40 guys getting through these group of people, right? They told us they were spearsmen, and they could throw them back then. I don't know if you saw the movie 300, but they could whip those spears around pretty good, so... then he called, let me skip down a little bit. First, real quick, Caesarea, where they were headed, was approximately 60 to 65 miles away. And so when are they leaving for this journey? At night, right? In fact, what does it say? It says, the The third hour, which the third hour is from the third hour of darkness. So we don't know exactly what time of the year it is, because obviously it gets dark at different times of the year, but we can assume it was probably around 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night when they took off. And again, were there street lights? No. So it was dark, right? So this massive army, they may have just thought this massive army was going out to attack or something. They didn't know why the army was leaving, but they were leaving. Okay. So they're heading down to Caesarea, and we're going to find they're going to stop at a little place called Antipatris, which is about 35 miles along the way. So this all-night journey, they're going to go 35 miles throughout the night and then stop for a rest. Supposedly this town was known as a kind of a large town for visitors because it was halfway between these two large cities. So any questions before I kind of zip through this last part for the last 10 minutes? I want to try to get us through, because the next part isn't really a part you want to break up. So what I like is he's writing this message to Felix, the governor there. And just so you know, this is interesting. Guess who Felix followed as governor of Judea? No. What? No. Nero was emperor overall. In fact, they believe that Paul may have been killed during the persecutions of Nero later on at that point. It was Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate passed this on to this fellow Felix, and in a few chapters, Felix will pass this on to Festus. Just a tiny bit about Felix. Felix was originally a slave, and he had earned his freedom, and his brother was high up in the Roman society, got him this position. This position of ruler over Judea was one nobody wanted, because the Jews were known as a rebellious, riotous crowd, as the last few chapters have showed us, right? And so they were always on edge. And so he's sending him to this man Felix, who started out as a slave, is now in a place of great power, but the historians tell us that he was a horribly wicked individual, violent individual in how he handled things. So this is to who Paul's going to. And then real quick, this is where we learn the commander's name for the first time, because he leads off with Claudius Lysias. To his excellency, I'm not going to read through all of this, but to his excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. The man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him. So who's the hero right now? Pretty good, huh? For I had learned that he was a Roman citizen. Yeah, right away? No, he's painting this picture like, I protected this Roman citizen. He got crazy lucky. Crazy lucky that turned out. But it sure makes him sound good, doesn't it? I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to the Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with the questions about the law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of the plot to be carried out against him, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered the accusers to present their case to you. So he's giving Felix a heads up that here's this guy, Paul. Be aware he's a Roman citizen. I protected him. Because, Felix might have wondered why, all these hundreds of guards were bringing this one little dude. From what the history tells us, Paul was only 5'5". He was this little bald dude, right? Maybe with bad eyes. And yet one of the biggest giants the world's ever known. So, last section, and then we'll be finished. So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him to Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. So half the army kept going because they realized they had outsmarted the people that were trying to kill him. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. And he was from Sicilia, because where was Paul born? But he was from Tarsus, which was in Sicilia, and what was the last one someone said? A part of Rome. So you were all right. Aren't those the best kind of questions? All right. I will give your case. I will hear your case when your accusers get here. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. And just the last thing I wanted to share with you for tonight is Herod's palace. Because again, is Paul officially charged with anything? Right? And he's a Roman citizen. Staying in Herod's palace was kind of like staying in a spa resort you just couldn't leave. Okay? It was a very wealthy, impressive place built by Herod. From what we know of Herod, you can be sure he built it to show off all of his wealth. And so Paul is getting to stay in a place where people can come and go and be with him. And at the same time, he has the opportunity to minister to who? All of these leaders. And we're going to see in just a moment, or next week, that he's going to just lay the gospel out before Felix. And God's going to allow him. So right now, Paul is in prison, but it's in one of it's kind of the rich people in our day who go to prison, but it's like a country club. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, and they can play golf and tennis and do all this other stuff. It's kind of like Martha Stewart's prison? Is she still in prison? Okay, I don't know much about Martha Stewart, nor why she's in prison. Why Martha Stewart's in prison? I do not know. Oh. Mm-hmm.
Well, what he in prison the whole time he was there. When they grabbed him and threw him in prison, he just wasn't changed.
You mean here?
He did not deserve death or imprisonment, but he was in prison the whole time he was in Jerusalem.
You mean in Jerusalem or here? In Jerusalem, he was in prison, but it was for a short time, and they had to keep him safe, really. I mean, that's what they were more keeping him safe than putting him in prison, because they knew that the people were trying to kill him and attack him. So yeah, but now he gets to stay in this kind of day spa kind of thing. Of course, that's easy for me to say. I can go home and leave. He can't, but God works the situation, and so this is all part of getting Paul to where? Rome, where Paul wants to go. So, any last thoughts, questions, comments? Good chapter, wasn't it? Good interaction, everybody.